Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Adam Golov, Marketing Communications Manager at Data Conversion Laboratory, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know we will allow time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. So please write your questions in the chat area as they come to mind. If we don't have time to answer them all, we'll make them available on our website. Next slide, please. For those of you who are not familiar with DCL, we convert and organize content to create electronic documents, populate databases, publish on the web, and basically get it ready for tomorrow's technology. Next slide. DCL services help you refine your document conversion strategy, identify document redundancy, extract metadata, and transform legacy and future documents for real needs, today and in the future. Next slide. We serve a very broad client base. Next slide. Spanning all industries. Next slide. Today, we are thrilled to introduce Amber Swope, Data Specialist at Data Strategies. Amber is an internationally recognized expert on data who specializes in helping teams develop their information architecture and implement data. With over 20 years of experience in the information development field, and 12 years of data expertise, Amber helps teams design and optimize their environments to improve efficiency and reduce costs. When she's not busy helping to change the world with XML, she can be found playing soccer, walking her pupster, and enjoying Portland, Oregon. Without further ado, welcome Amber.
Thanks, Adam. All right, so the first thing we want to talk about is the fact that this presentation is based off the results of a survey that DCL and Data Strategies conducted. And the first thing we want to know is, of the folks on the webinar, did you participate in the survey? So if you did, please say yes. This is our first poll. If you didn't, say no. And if you had no idea that there was a survey, let us know and select the what survey. And while we get that information, I'm going to get started because I have a lot of exciting information to talk about. So the first thing is who participated in this survey. So we had 149 respondents for this question, which is what I expect is the one we got the most responses for. And what was interesting about this was the small number of folks that are participating from professional education, such as higher learning or university. So what this is telling us is the folks that participated in the survey are more in the corporate space. Adam and I, when we discussed the poll results, we looked at this and said, well, with the numbers being pretty small for large enterprise, maybe one of the questions was for folks, well, what is large enterprise? And maybe when we do the poll again, the survey again, we'll maybe have a little bit more information about what we mean by those definitions. Adam, do you have the poll results?
Yes, I do. So 8% said they did participate in the survey. 31% said they did not participate in the survey. And 62% said, what survey?
Well, that means that we can now include you in the next survey because we do this one periodically because we're trying to understand what the needs are for folks in the learning and training space around their content. So as you can see, we have a lot of corporate folks who participated. And one of the things that would be really interesting is as I go through the presentation, particularly for those who did not participate in the survey, if you have questions, please put them into the chat so that we have some good discussion at the end. So one of the questions we asked is, what audience is your organization training address? And as you can see, we had a nice range here where we have folks doing customer training and onboarding, and as you know, a nice breakdown. And one of the things that we're wondering is our next poll, which is, do you send employees to customer training? Because our original question didn't ask that, and My experience has been that a lot of organizations do not have separate training for employees, particularly around, if it's technical training for their products, that they take advantage of the fact that they have that training available for customers, and when they onboard employees, they take advantage of those courses and send their employees as well. And we did not include that question on the survey, so I figured I could put it in the presentation. And quite honestly, this is more of a curiosity thing for me than something that I'm going to speak a lot to, but I'm interested to know how many folks are sort of double dipping with their educational information. So how are we doing on the poll?
So Amber, with the poll just closing, 77% said they do not send employees to customer training, and 23% said they do send employees to customer training.
All right, so it's interesting to see, and again, of course, we could have another whole survey around that, just that question alone, but we aren't. I'm going to move along. So what we wanted to really understand were what were the greatest challenges that folks have when they're delivering training. And what was fascinating was that maintenance and out-of-date information were our top two contenders. And I think of them as things that go together. I mean, if you can't maintain your content, it is going to become out of date. This is not surprising at all to me. I talk to a lot of folks in the training space and in other content creation spaces, and the fact that your content needs to be updated and it changes so frequently now that if you have multiple sources of content, this can be really difficult. So one of the other things that we wanted to understand is why are you guys having this challenge? And we want to know who's developing the content. And that number of 63% of your content being handled by individual groups and divisions versus 20% of being under a corporate group or an umbrella that has potentially better support and coordination, I think that plays into why this is so challenging. And the next question is about maintenance, and the numbers here play out pretty similarly. So what we're trying to understand is, are the same people who are creating the initial content also maintaining it? And this slide seems to represent that perhaps that maybe some content is actually created initially, but then maintained again by individuals and other groups. That decentralization could really play a big factor in why this is so hard. So I thought, why is it so difficult to do this? And I really think that the first part is that you probably have multiple instances of your content. You might have the same information in both an LMS, a web-based training. It could be showing up in a mobile app. If you're doing textbooks, it could be there. If it's in student guides or instructor guides, all those multiple instances of information means that it takes more time to go track them down and to update them. This is compounded if the content is managed in multiple repositories, because you might not even know where it is. You have to go find it, and you may not have access to it, particularly if you're that person who's in a technical group at your company. You might not have access to the original source that's stored in a content management system or repository that the folks in corporate training have. The other challenge is that you probably are using different tools. If you are creating your content in the deliverable that you present, then I can almost guarantee you're using different tools. And that means that these folks who are in these other groups might not know what to do with those tools, or might not even have access to them. And you're trying to present that information differently in different outputs. For instance, information that is presented on an LMS may need to be chunked differently than when it's presented in other delivery platforms. So you say, well, what could make this easier? Well, the first thing we'd like to see is that you guys could have a common source, that you'd have one source of this information rather than multiple instances of it. If you can update a single source of information and have that update apply to all the instances where it is delivered, well, that can greatly reduce the amount of work that you have. And one of the challenges is, well, how do you get there? So the first thing about having a single source of information is that it has to be structured. And what I mean by that is it has to be modular. You cannot have the exact same information be available in an LMS, a mobile app, regulatory certification information, a student guide, an instructor manual, and a textbook if those pieces of information aren't modular. You can't have an entire chapter, for instance, from an InDesign file be available for your LMS. That's just not how it works. It needs to be standardized. If you want to be able to have information be useful and pertinent to different deliverable types, you have to know what it is that you're going to get when you open the file. These files have to be standalone units, which means that they would be separately managed. And this is particularly important when we talk about assessment. If you are doing certification, you need to know that you're not presenting the exact same question to the same person year after year. You need to say, oh, I need to manage this question, this assessment item separately, and maybe track metrics on how often is that delivered, or maybe that assessment item needs to be different for multiple people who are taking the exam at the same time. You need to have that information not only be modular and standalone, but typed. If you open a file, that file should have a specific purpose. If it is instructional information where it's describing a concept, then it needs to be structured in one way, versus if that file has a learning objective in it, well, it needs to be structured differently. And I talk a little bit here about the association with learning objectives. If you have entire chapters, multiple pages, 20, 30 pages of information, that might cover more than one learning objective. If you are looking to have modular delivery, maybe doing pre-assessment so you can do personalized delivery of content, you'll have to be able to bind those learning objectives at a more granular level than, for instance, an entire chapter, or in some cases, an entire module, definitely at a lower level than an entire course. And the other point of this is that it has to be easily reusable. You could go through all the effort to structure all your content, but people cannot reuse it if they cannot find it. I'm going to talk a little bit about DITA, which is the Darwin Information Typing Architecture, as a candidate for that common source. The beauty of it that it has is it starts off with modular topics that are in standardized XML. That is the entire foundation of DITA, which is typing architecture, and therefore it has types. So most folks know about DITA because they use it in more traditional types of information, such as tech pubs. But what most folks don't realize is that DITA also has support for learning objectives, learning overviews, learning summaries, learning content, and assessment. And that if you are in an organization where folks may have already made the investment in DITA, such as a tech pubs organization, I see it in customer support organizations, professional services. Sometimes the marketing folks are the ones who are first in XML. If there is the opportunity for you to share content with them for your learning content, then DITA might be a great option for you. And for folks who aren't in that situation, it still might be a great option for you. I have clients that are, for instance, educational publishers that say we need a neutral XML source. We need to be able to get our content out for delivery in all these different platforms. And this one is the one that's most modular and has more tool support than any other, and they started off with this. And having this common source is the key to having automated reuse. For instance, if you want to have the same assessment appear in a practice test and in an LMS, you have to be able to know that, first of all, the items that you're using are questions, and be able to organize them and update them so that they update at the same time. So really quickly, what is DITA? As I mentioned, it's the Darwin Information Typing Architecture. It's a modular structured XML format. It has been around now for almost 15 years. And if you want to learn more about it, go up to Oasis. It's got a lot of information, and you can do search. I know that DCL has some other information, some resources on learning organizations who use DITA for their content. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but like I said, it's a mature standard. It's been out there for a long time. DITA Oasis committee is now working on the 2.0 release. The most recent one out is 1.3, and it is actively maintained standard because I know that some folks, there are standards out there that have had lapsed support and maintenance, and this is not one of them. So which organizations are responsible for preparing content training materials? So this was one of the questions that we were really interested in, and what was striking is who is doing your work. You know, you have subject matter experts as well as the training folks, which is great that the training folks are involved because, let's be honest, a lot of folks think that because they've had education, they know how to design and structure educational materials. Just because I know how to read doesn't make me a great writer. So you have these subject matter experts who are participating in the training material development. So what does that mean? Well, the benefit is that they can give you the technical expertise, and in theory, they should have a lot of knowledge about how users are intended to use the functionality and features that they've designed. The challenges, on the other hand, are that training developers may not have access to your tools in the training department. They may have, if they do have access, they might not know how to use them. And I can tell you that most of the subject matter experts that I know do not have a background in instructional design. And it's not enough to simply put together a presentation and communicate that knowledge and call it training. That's knowledge transfer. That is not necessarily training. And unless, in my personal view, unless somebody with some instructional design understanding helps them structure their content along to corresponding to the learning objectives, you don't get a good training experience. The other thing about relying on subject matter experts is that this is not their primary task, and they may not have the time to update the materials and to give it the attention and priority that you need them to. So one of the things that you could do is, if you have your content in a single XML source, is to provide an easy-to-use authoring tool. There's a number of authoring tools out there for XML. Many of them are DITA aware because it's, as I mentioned, it's been a long-term standard. I'll be honest with you, if you want subject matter experts to update XML, then you're going to need to do some customization. You want to provide them an experience that associates the content that they are preparing with the learning objectives that you want them to support. If you don't do that, then they're simply going to put the information down the way they think of it, and not the way that, for instance, a training professional would have structured the information. The other thing is that if you are working in an environment that allows them to update the XML, you can track their updates. You'll be able to see, hey, this is what they changed in this file versus that file, and it would all be centrally managed. It's easier for them, and it's easier for you. So I'm going to move on quickly to talking a little bit more about assessment. And so we have our next poll, which is, does your training include assessments? The reality is not everyone's training does. And I understand that just because you have assessment doesn't mean that it serves the same purpose in all instances. So while the poll's open, I'm going to move on. In the survey, what folks told us was 65% of them said yes, they do, and 34% said no, they didn't. And I find that really interesting because if you aren't assessing the training experience, then how are you gauging your effectiveness? And I've talked with some learning professionals that say, well, if you're not doing assessment, then it really is not, it's just knowledge transfer. It's not what they would consider to be real training because they have no way to get any feedback on the acquisition of knowledge. So Adam, what are our poll results?
So Amber, 75% have said they do and their training does include assessments, and 25% says their training does not include assessments.
Excellent, thank you. And you know, one of the reasons that folks might not have assessment in their training is they simply don't have a mechanism to deliver the training in a way that would track the assessments and the user's ability to take a test and have it be meaningful. And so I know that there are folks who would love to have assessment that simply don't yet. So what we asked in the survey was, at what level do you track the assessment? And this was pretty interesting in that, you know, they tracked it at the entire course level. Others are tracking it at the module or lesson level. And does the assessment result in certification? And almost 55% said yes, and 45% said no. And if you are a learning professional and you fall into that yes category, you have to have a way to track this. And this is where things like an LMS become so much more important. Depending on the technical material that you are trying to present to folks, maybe you have assessments, but they're not actually questions. Maybe they're doing performance of an activity in front of an instructor. But the role of assessment, engaging effectiveness, is just so important. And one of the things like I mentioned, is that DITA supports assessment out of the box. We have 7 types: open question, which would be more of an essay, single select, multiple select, true, false, sequence, match, and hotspot, which is that awesome one where you have a picture and, you know, if it's for medical information, identify where the spleen is on this picture. Again, the challenge with a lot of assessment is that the LMS, if you're in one, sometimes doesn't allow for the variation of assessment that folks would want to have. The other key around assessment is it's just questions if it's not bound to learning objectives. So a lot of folks use one of the flavors of Bloom's taxonomy. Every time I ask folks, hey, are you using Bloom's taxonomy? The first question I get back is, well, which one? Every time I turn around, there always seems to be a new version of it. If you're not using Bloom's to organize your learning objectives, I'm sure that you have some other type of methodology so that you know what you are trying to communicate. And in DITA, one of the ways that we do this is we create the learning objective, and then we associate the learning objective to each individual assessment topic and then to the associated instructional information, which means that if you have 3 learning objectives, one for the different, each one applying to a different Bloom's level, then you can have that association to the same content, different content, and it gives you a lot more flexibility because it's so modular. So back to the question of why is this so difficult to maintain and update your information? And I think that this slide tells us a lot about that, which is, in what format do you create materials? The fact that folks are creating their content in multiple formats means that they have multiple instances of the content. And our leading format here is PowerPoint. Now, I love PowerPoint for presentations, but I think of it as that dark alley of content creation formats because it's really hard to reuse. This is the scene from The Matrix when Neo's looking out the car, and it's like, yeah, that does not look welcoming. If I'm creating content in PowerPoint, I can't get it easily to anywhere else. I can't even get it into Word very easily, and that's really frustrating. So when you have your content in PowerPoint and Word and FrameMaker and Google Slides and Captivate and Camtasia, and Google Docs, and maybe you're even creating content directly in an LMS, what this does is that it's fragmenting your content, and that means that you have it in multiple places, and that makes it impossible to automate. If you change something in a PowerPoint, it is impossible to automate that same content being updated in another tool. So why do I like XML? If you have a central repository with XML source in it that is modular and bound to learning objectives, then you can take those units, and they're called topics, and organize them into collections in your content management system. And then the key with XML is that it separates the content from the formatting. So rather than a citation to another document being formatted as italics, it's actually formatted with an element called cite, so that when the transform renders that information and actually generates the information that you need, for instance, if you need HTML for web-based training, or a PDF for an instructor guide, or you're sending a course to an LMS, or you're releasing your textbooks in EPUB, you can have that same information be presented differently and optimized for each of these output formats from the same source. That means that you have one tool set, you have one repository, you have to do some planning, you have to have the architecture, you have to know what topics, what purpose they serve, and how they're related to your learning objectives, and you have to be very clear about what your output formats look like. But the reality is you already know what those output formats look like because you're customizing them in each of the tools as you're creating them. So if you could have all your content in one place and deliver it out to all these other places, that means that you can actually automate a lot of that work. So for instance, you have a question, and the question needs to be updated, and it appears in 3 different places. It's in a mobile app, it's in an LMS, and a practice test. You can update it in the data, in the XML, and then based on the status change, if you have configured your system this way, you could automatically regenerate its instances and update it. Now, we all know that there are challenges, for instance, particularly with automating and updating content in an LMS, because you can't update content in a course while people are in it. So let's be realistic about automation. But we're talking here about automation of keeping your content up to date, and that there's easier ways to do that. One of the other things that I have talked with my friends in the learning industry about is the fact that the learning objective changes. They have a hard time finding all the associated content that applies to that learning objective. And if you have the content in data and you have it with an association between that learning objective and its associated content, if you make those updates, you can automate the generation, not necessarily the delivery, but the generation of all those different formats. And then you can control when they get updated and when they get pushed out to your students or your learners. So let's talk a little bit more about delivery. So Adam, we have our next poll, which is how do you deliver content? And I'm going to move on while the poll is live. When we asked this in the survey, here's what folks said. They have a large number of printed materials. The leader by just a slight hair with slide presentations, which is not at all surprising. Half of you are doing videos. That is excellent in terms of a learning experience, but maybe not so much when you're trying to create and maintain content. Lots of online courses, not so many mobile apps. And I think that's really interesting because I have talked to some folks who are delivering them, and they find that they're really helpful for helping people for having glossary, like, basically the replacement for flashcards so that folks can, if they need to learn new terms and stuff, they can do that sitting, on the bus or wherever they are, or taking mini quizzes to help them prepare. But it takes a lot of work to have a good mobile app developed and then to feed it the content as you need to. So we have ebooks, lots of PDFs, and then we have some other. So Adam, what were the results on our poll?
So Amber, the results of the poll was 11% use the LMS, 22% use web-based training, 44% use both, and 22% use neither.
Oh, excellent. Okay, that's interesting information. So what I'm seeing here is that lots of folks are being asked to deliver information in different ways. And that, again, why is this so difficult? And I think it's because folks are creating this information in different places. And the big challenge, if I'm looking at this slide, is telling me it's videos, because videos are a totally different type of output. And they are typically, the script for them and all the information that you're putting in them are usually, that information is usually created and maintained in a separate tool. And there's no magic fix for this, right? For me, what I think about is whether or not that information has been structured as an informational architect to say, okay, is the content that goes into a video exactly the same as other content? Is it different? If it's different, then how is it different? If it is different, how do we know when it needs to update? Because a lot of times when something updates in one location, it doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily know that it needs to get updated somewhere else. So here's in the actual survey, our LMS response. So then we talked about what devices we're expecting the learners to experience the content. So we see a resounding desktop presence here. Some tablet, not quite 50% there. I was surprised. I would have expected it to be closer to 50%. Some on phone. The desktop, that's telling me that they're, this could be skewed by the type of content that the folks are creating, who took the survey, but the reality is that I'm expecting that other is also instructor-led training. So how would you rate the demand for training content in your organization in the past year? Almost 50% said it's gone up. 25% said it remained the same. Less than 5% said it's gone down. That tells me that if you combine the has gone up and remains the same, it tells me that there's an important role for training information. When I talk to folks and I ask them about training, they get numbers like this. They say the demand's up, but they don't feel like they've been getting the support to be able to do what it is that they need to do. And some of the folks I've talked to have said this, part of that is the perception that the importance of video, as we saw from one of the previous questions, is that anybody can do a video and that they don't need instructional designers to do video, that anybody who can use one of the video tools platforms can do this. And I think that one of the biggest challenge for the learning profession is to show their value. And to me, it comes down to how you handle the analytics, because if you can say, hey, we can prove the effectiveness of the training that we have created that is bound to learning objectives and is structured by a learning professional, utilizing the technical knowledge of the subject matter expert, then I think you have a better case for the value in your organization. By not being able to get analytics, it's really much more difficult to prove your value in these organizations. And what we see here is that 33% have said that their request for analytics has gone up, 24 the same. A lot of folks just aren't even sure. And I found that fascinating. I wonder if it's because they don't have them and they don't track the value, or if they don't have them and no one's asked it for it. It's one of those things where I'd love to do a follow-on survey just around the analytics and understanding what's going on here. But of course, we aren't going to do a full survey just on this. But I think that having good metrics is where you really can stand your ground as a learning professional and say, hey, this is where we add value. If you aren't tracking anything, I don't know how you're going to be able to prove that your training is effective, that it takes a learning professional to create effective training. And it's really difficult to track these things. Let's just be candid about that. So there's a couple of ways that you can get metrics. The first is in the delivery experience itself, around the effectiveness of the training. It's easier to do in an LMS, but as we saw, not everyone's in an LMS. I mean, a significant number of people are simply not able to deliver their content that way. So the effectiveness metrics are more difficult if you're doing instructor-led training or web-based training. The other way that you could look at metrics is on being able to reuse information and collect metrics on the amount of time that it takes you to update a course or a suite of courses. Let's say you're working for a technology company and a new product release comes out, and you, like everyone else in the organization, is expected to deliver new information that matches the new release. Well, if you could start tracking what that effort takes for you, what information you are reusing, and you can't see me doing little air quotes with my fingers, reusing from other organizations, because that reuse simply might be old school reuse, which is you copy and paste it from somebody else. A lot of folks reuse information that way. They see what someone else has provided and said, oh, that would work for me, and so they take a copy of it. The challenge there is that if the person's work that you copy doesn't know you did that, and their work updates, yours will not. And that's where sharing content rather than doing this copy and paste is a better option. But looking at what information appears in multiple places, does the same learning objective appear in multiple courses? Does the same question appear in multiple tests, exams? Are you able to reuse the same information for customer-facing training versus internal training? Folks said no, they're not sending their internal folks to the customer training. Well, if they're getting training, then in theory, that means you have two courses, one for external folks and one for internal folks. So if you have the chance, I would highly recommend that you start getting some metrics on what it takes you to create your content, so that you can get some data around why this is so hard for you. Because you're not, until you can show that this is inefficient and not the best use of your time. So for instance, if you could spend your time updating one source instead of multiple sources, what could you do with that extra time? Make more training, do more learning objectives, and do different types of assessment, maybe make more videos. Without those metrics, it's going to be difficult for you to make that case. So one more poll. Have you been asked to provide translated training? And we asked in a slightly different question in the survey is your content translated? And only a quarter of folks said yes. And that made us wonder, is it that you haven't been asked to provide it in another language? Or is it that you have been asked, but you simply can't do it because of the costs or the complexity around that effort? So I'm really interested to see who's been asked to do this. So this is another one of those situations where if you were able to use XML for your source, because XML is semantically organized, not by presentation, It supports localization and translation of content. And this is the reason why a lot of folks are moving to XML now, even if they're not in tech pubs, but simply because they want to be able to reduce their localization costs. As the companies are having more and more global impact, the expectation from folks is that they get the content in the language that is their first language. So what were our results for the poll, Adam?
So Amber, 78% have said yes, they've been asked to provide translated training, and 22% said they have not been asked to provide translated training.
That is what I was expecting, is that a lot of folks, although a lot of folks aren't providing it, I think a lot of folks are being asked to do it. And if you have content in PowerPoint and Word and Camtasia and in an LMS and maybe in InDesign and all this stuff, the first question you would ask then is what content do we translate? Which of these sources of content do you translate? Because none of those are going to be easy, right? So if you could be in XML with a single source, you would send the source files to translation. And then when you get them back, then you put them through the transform and you generate the content in that language. And that saves you a huge amount of money on translation, being able to leverage translation memory and being able to automate the presentation of content in every language. For those of you who have translated content, you should be aware, and probably are aware, that the same information appears differently in different languages. If you are having to manually update that in every instance of the deliverables, you just exponentially increased your workload. So if you've already got a challenge creating and updating your content in your source language, which in my case, for me, it's English, then try doing that for 5 more languages. It just becomes impossible. So if you're being asked to produce localized or translated content, I highly recommend that you look at XML as an option, as a neutral source for you to be able to go to translation. So for instance, the example of the citation to another work, rather than it being italics in English, which could mean a lot of things, let's be honest. Italics in English could be an actual quote. It could be a reference to another document. It could be a new term. It could be emphasis. By using the cite element, it very clearly communicates the purpose of that content when it goes to translation, so that when it goes to translation in German or in Chinese, then they are able to present it. They just simply change the information inside, and then the automation comes with the generation that says, oh, citations in Chinese are presented this way, and citations in German are presented this way, and citations in English are presented this other way. So, in summary, we talked about why is it so hard for you to be able to keep track of all this content that you have. And I think that the first thing is that you have to, if you want to automate, you need to be able to consolidate your content into a single neutral source. And when I say neutral, I'm thinking XML, because it is a markup language that semantically identifies the content and not how it looks. And once you have that, then you can say, oh, we're going to have one creation environment that is easy for people to use. That's a really simple statement. It is not the simplest to actually implement because it takes time. You have to say, who is using this? Is this simply for instructional designers, or is it also for subject matter experts? If it's for both, well, then we sure need to make sure that it's easy for the subject matter expert to go in and say, oh, you want me to give you the technical information around this learning objective, and for them to be able to do that without having to learn a whole separate tool suite, and that it feel natural to them. Automate your content formatting. If you are spending time reformatting content in these different tools, if it's in Word, it's in FrameMaker, it's in an LMS, it's in InDesign, it's in PowerPoint. If you started in XML, then you would be able to reduce that extra work that you're doing. I can't emphasize this enough. And the thing is that folks say, well, you know, if we start in XML, then we can't get to PowerPoint. Well, there are people working on tools and have betas of tools that have this type of a capability. You know, there are some folks who say, yeah, we can have a slide-like representation. Maybe that's acceptable for you. But most folks really want PowerPoint, and I get it, right? It's great for presentation. But if you need to go to PowerPoint, that's one thing. It doesn't mean you should start in PowerPoint. Automate the content generation. So rather than you having to go in and update it in Word and update it in PowerPoint and then update it in the LMS, if you had one source of content, you could update the XML and run 3 transforms, one that gets you out to your slides, one that gets you out to your instructor manual, and one that gets you the course into your SCORM package or whatever the unit is that needs to be imported into your LMS. And then leverage that association between your learning objectives and your content. Again, if you have a really strong instructional design paradigm that starts with your learning objectives, you want to be able to know, if I update this learning objective, it updates in every instance of every place that it appears and along with its associated content. I have folks that who've been in DITA for a while who have been able to leverage their initial investment and build in that automation. And as much as I love to say the word automate, I want to be sure that I'm being realistic with you and saying, you know, you have to walk before you run. Automation comes after you know what you're doing. And so one of the things I would encourage folks is, if you haven't looked at XML, to think about doing a proof of concept. Take some of your learning content, download an XML editor with a free trial license that has that's DITA aware, and try it out. Read some papers, get some sample content from folks like me or other XML experts, and look at what this source format could do to really help you when you're trying to update and maintain your content collections. So I have 10 minutes for questions. Adam, did we get any questions?
Thank you, Amber. Yes, we have. And the first one is the first one is, what is a CCMS?
Oh, my bad. Component Content Management System. And what that means is that it manages smaller, more granular units than a document management system. So for instance, if you're familiar with SharePoint or FileNet or any of these systems where they manage entire documents, the reality is that you don't necessarily want to update everything in a 25-page document. You want to update that smaller unit. If you're going to chunk your content at that more granular level, then you're going to want a repository that tracks that content at that smaller level.
Excellent. Thank you, Amber. The next question that has come in is, in DITA, what is the best way to tie content to learning objectives?
Oh, it's a great question. There are multiple ways to do this, and it really comes down to your business requirements. The one way you can do it is through using a DITA reuse mechanism called a content reference. If you have for instance, between a learning objective and an assessment topic, you can simply content reference that learning objective right into the assessment topic. That's great as long as that is a persistent relationship and you want to be able to go, for instance, go into your repository and say, oh, show me all the assessments that have this learning objective. That doesn't work so great if the relationship will not be persistent. So there are 2 other methods. One of them is using subject scheme with key references. That's more complicated, but it gives you a level of abstraction so that if you have one or more learning objectives that apply to any given question, then you can manage it that way. The third way folks are doing is to use relationship tables, which is an out-of-the-box mechanism that allows abstracted relationships that say, in this context, this learning objective applies to this assessment. Now, like I said, there's pros and cons on all those methods. Dawn Stevens and I are actually working on a presentation about that exact topic. So that should be, we should be having something available on how do you choose, which is the best way to do this, and what are your, if none of those are perfect, what are your options? That's a great question. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Amber. The last question has come in. It's kind of long, so please bear with me. How do you organize translated content within a DITA XML tool? Do the target languages attach at the topic level, or something smaller like a translation unit, which is about the size of a sentence usually?
That's a great question, and the answer is unfortunately not as straightforward as one as I would like. It really depends on the component content management system you are using. Different systems manage it differently. I know of some that manage it at the topic unit, and so, for instance, they manage the topic. They have version control on the topic level, so therefore, when the topic is in its release state and in its source language, it goes out to translation and it comes back in 5 languages, and those 5 translated instances of the topic share the same GUID, which is the global unique identifier, and they come back into the repository, and so that association is there. There are other repositories that manage content at that more granular level, and so if you have a CCMS, you would want to ask them that. If you do not have a CCMS and you're thinking about getting one, you would also want to ask how they support the localization. And there's lots of webinars out there on how the different ways that happens. You know, it really depends. Like I said, it's very vendor specific. Sorry, not the easiest answer, and not probably the answer you wanted either. Sorry.
Thank you, Amber. The last question that's come in is, what technology is needed to start using XML?
Well, at a minimum, you need an XML authoring tool or an XML editor. There are a number of them out there. They vary by their complexity and their usage. You can, there's a whole host of them out there. If you type in, if you go to Google and type in DITA XML authoring tool or DITA XML editor, a number of them will come up. You know, the thing about the authoring tools is that depending on the tool, it can look really complicated. There are tools that are designed specifically for subject matter experts. There are tools that are integrated with certain component content management systems. But if you're trying to do a proof of concept, like I said, I would type that in and see which ones are offering a free 1-month trial license. And as long as they have DITA 1.3 install as part of the support that they'll download, you would have everything that you needed to start creating some content. The beauty and the bane of XML is that it separates the content from the formatting, and you must transform it. And that means that you have to have transforms available. Now, out of the box, the majority of the tools do not have great transforms for learning content. So you can go through the effort of structuring your content and having assessment and building practice tests and things like that. But unless you have a SCORM compliant transform, it's not going to give you what you're expecting necessarily. Again, Dawn Stevens and I co-chair the DITA Learning and Training Subcommittee. We're working on what we would like vendors to provide, and maybe through the subcommittee being able to provide some transforms that folks can use. While I have your attention, I'm going to give a plug for the DITA Learning Training Subcommittee. We are actively trying to talk with members of the learning community to say, hey, what is it that you need? If you are interested in talking with us and saying, hey, if DITA did this, or if tools did this, I would be so much more willing to try and use it, please contact me. We're working to say, how do we get down to the barriers of adoption here? Because the need for multi-channel publishing for learning content is becoming greater, not less. And the folks in tech pubs and in other organizations are getting the benefit. How do we help you get the benefit too? So please connect with me on LinkedIn, send me an email directly, look up the DITA Learning and Training Subcommittee and the website. We want to hear from you. We feel like we have an option that could be potentially really helpful, but we know that there are some pieces that we need to give so that you can do an effective proof of concept. Any other questions? I think 3 minutes left.
Well, thank you, Amber, and thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. This will conclude today's broadcast. You will be able to access the recorded version in the webinar archive section of our website, located at www.dclab.com. Also, our next webinar will be this Thursday, February 1st at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, titled Unleash Your Content, Unlocking the Value of Your Existing Product Content to Create Great Customer Experiences, with Joe Gelb, President of Zoom In Software, and Mark Rose, President of DCL. Thank you, Amber, and thank you, everyone, for attending, and have a great day.
Thanks, you too.